having 6 children apiece, and their 6 children had 6 children. There's so many of them, we couldn't keep up.
What was their name?
But there are a lot of people in Boston.
Well, Florence always talked about the relatives in Boston.
Florence spoke about the
Florence
people in Boston.
We have a lot of
Who
relatives.
were they? He was a big fat guy.
They were my great aunts. They were our great aunts and uncles. The 2 great aunts, Grandpa Miller's 2 sisters, Aunt Annie, and Aunt, I forgot her name. Aunt Annie and Aunt, the other 2, and Aunt Lizzie, we'll call it. So they each married. They married Uncle Abe Goldstein.
Oh, I remember
And
him.
the other one married Uncle
He was so big and
Danny Zakovich, his name was, I think. They each had 6 children. Each of their 6 children married and had 6 more children. And every time they married, they had 6 children. So there's so many. We used to go, Uncle Sammy, my mother's youngest brother, used to take us up to Boston to see Aunt Annie. So she would call to say her visitors from New York are there, because at that time I lived in New York.
right.
Before you knew it, 45 people came to see
Yeah,
us.
and I remember he was a big
There,
fat
there
guy.
is such a, each 6 had 6. There's so
But
many.
their
That's a lot of
name
relatives.
wasn't
Now,
what I was
Uncle Abe
remem-
Goldstein,
Yeah.
who was my great uncle and Annie's brother, he was a traveling salesman. So I got to know him. Florence and I, we got to know him very well because he was always visiting. And when he visited us in New York and Philadelphia, he always stayed with us. He never stayed with us.
Well-
Did he have traveling salesman
Uncle
jokes
Abe.
to tell you?
Uncle Abe. Tell me, Uncle
Abe
Abe.
Goldstein.
But how is he related to us?
Uncle Abe Goldstein was, I told you, my great aunt's husband's brother. My great aunt's husband's married him, Uncle Abe.
What was her name? Annie?
Yeah, Aunt Annie.
Aunt Annie. So that would be our great aunt,
Great Aunt Annie.
Annie and Annie.
Annie Goldberg.
So Aunt Annie was related to my father?
Well, yes, she was his aunt.
It was
And
his
my
aunt.
great aunt.
I see. Okay. All right. I didn't know. What was her maiden?
Did you hear about your father, Uncle Eddie?
No.
My grandmother, Miller, Rosie Miller, was married to an American, my grandfather, Robert Miller. So she had 3 boys and a girl. My mother was the oldest. Then came Eddie, Marty, and Sammy was born much later. So Uncle Eddie was the oldest boy. Now, my grandfather, Robert, was a complete American, and he wouldn't have anything to do with the Jewish religion, but he respected my grandmother because she was Jewish. So when he wanted to eat other stuff that he was, forbidden, he would eat it outside. Like on Saturdays he would go out. But anyway, Uncle Eddie was the oldest boy, and my grandmother wanted him to be bar mitzvahed. So in those days, the rabbis would come to the house.
That's what I had.
So the rabbi would come to the house to prepare Uncle Eddie for the bar mitzvah.
Right.
Uncle Eddie didn't want to be bar mitzvah. My Uncle Eddie didn't believe in education at all. He was a marvelous electrician, but he never learned. He learned it on his own, not in schools.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, he used to get annoyed when the rabbi would come, and in those days, long beards. So the rabbi used to come. They used to sit at a table. They used to daven. So one day, Uncle Eddie was sick of the whole thing. So the rabbi came to daven. Uncle Eddie chewed a big wad of chewing gum, and when the rabbi went down, he took the chewing gum and pasted the beard to the table. He never came back, and nobody was ever bar mitzvahed in my mother's family. And he used to lisp.
You're
That'd be
kidding.
funny.
My father? What part did he sing?
Yeah. Tell me, pretty maiden, are there anyone at home like you? There are a few.
Yeah, I've heard
That-
that.
And every summer, Uncle Marty lived in Atlantic City.
Yeah.
He was an architect in Atlantic City, and he lived in Atlantic City, right about a mile a couple of
On
miles from the
Adriatic
beach.
Avenue.
Where?
Adriatic Avenue.
Well, anyway, so everybody used to get together in the summertime at the beach and meet at Uncle Marty. But that day they decided before going to the beach they were going to play baseball, the men against the women. So Uncle Eddie came on the women's side, was showing them how to run to the beach. And your brother, Carl, got on the roof of Uncle Marty's house and threatened to jump off.
Yes.
And all the men were waiting for him to jump off.
Yes,
But he didn't.
he did.
You know what else Carl did?
Yeah.
My Uncle Eddie and Aunt Irene had a hardware store
I
in
heard that.
Philadelphia. So they had, those days, they had barrels of nails, barrels of this.
Yeah.
He buried himself in a barrel of nails.
Yeah.
Carl was terrible.
Yes, he's bad. He was
He
so bad.
was. They used to have such trouble. When he used to come to New York, so we lived in the West Bronx, which was a very posh part of the Bronx. And the house there had an elevator. And we lived on the 4th floor, 5th floor, and 3rd floor. But at that time, I think we lived on the 5th. We had 3 different apartments in the same house. So he used to get up on the elevator and ride
Go up and down, up and down. Mm-hmm. He also crossed the street where we lived, crossed the street and climbed up on the roof across the street of the houses across the
But he
street.
grew up to be
But-
a very nice
But
man.
when he grew up, he was so different.
And when he grew up, you would never know what kind of child he was.
When she was born, Aunt Irene was 17 years old. We lived in New York at the time. I was 8 years old. So, Aunt Irene was 17, and Uncle Eddie and Aunt Irene lived with my grandmom and Grandpa Miller. So, Aunt Irene was so young, my mother said that we're going to move to Philadelphia. And my father said it was all right because he was such a great jeweler that the head jeweler of Philadelphia wanted him to work for him. So my father had this wonderful job. He bought a beautiful car. Because in New York, he didn't need the car. We were right near so we moved to Philadelphia, and my mother took care of, we all lived together. There was a 3-story house, private house, but 3 stories.
Was that in Strawberry Mansion?
And I remember there were 2 bathrooms and 4 rooms on the 2nd floor. So Aunt Irene, Uncle Eddie, and Florence had the back part. We had the other part. So my mother took care of Florence, and they were so crazy about it. So we were there for a year, and my father got calls from New York to come back because his 2 brothers used to work for my father. My father was a jeweler. My father didn't sell jewelry. He made the jewelry.
Okay.
He designed the jewelry.
Oh, yeah.
And they worked for him. One was a watchmaker, one was a diamond setter. They said, Morris, we can't get jobs. We want you back in New York. So we left Florida. We left there after a year, and we moved back to New York. And that's when we stayed in New York. And we stayed in New York for 23 years. First, I lived in Brooklyn. Then we moved to Philadelphia for a year to take care of Florence. Then we moved back. I lived in Brooklyn. And then we moved to the East Bronx. Then we moved to the West Bronx, the posh Bronx. And then